So, for the 11 people who have already downloaded version 1.1, here's what's new in the update. Speech bubbles use an inverse hull to have an outline. You can now change the color of speech bubble text and outline easily. There is a new button in the add-on panel that imports a polygonal speech bubble, which essentially means that you get squares and triangles and other shapes as speech bubbles. There is now an option to have a connecting line between speech bubbles, and you can turn any object you have in your scene into a speech bubble, which gives you the option to have the connecting line and the spikes, and I've also made some smaller features and fixes. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-on, Install, and you'll find your downloaded zip file, and don't forget to turn it on. If you have an older version installed, make sure to remove it first. If you press N, you should see a new panel called Speech Bubble that wasn't there before. The first set of buttons let you append the different types of speech bubble, polygonal and metable. If you click on one of them, it should appear in your scene at the world origin. If you have a camera in your scene, then it will automatically append in the view of and facing the camera. If you're using a metable, then it will have a track to constraint to the camera, but that doesn't work with the flat polygonal shapes, as the front surface doesn't stay flat when not in the center of the screen, so it doesn't track to the camera. Since this add-on is here to save you time when making speech bubbles, it has set some keyframes automatically. This large empty and the arrow empty have a scale of 1 at the current frame and a scale of 0 20 frames beforehand. If you go the other way on the timeline, you'll notice that the text is automatically typing out at a speed of a character every other frame. There are options to change where in the camera's view it appears, and how long the scale takes, but this only affects new bubbles, and most of the time you won't need to touch this, so you can just close that. This spherical empty to the right is what the tail points to, so if you move this to your character's mouth, you can parent it to the head bone, and the arrow will always point to their mouth. This arrow empty is the thing that's tracking to the spherical empty, and also gets some scale keyframes when you append it. These two circular empties control the shape of the tail and are parented to the arrow empty. If you want to make the tail thinner, then you can just select it and press S to scale it. When scaling the bubble in one axis, you want to be in local mode and use either X or Y. You may notice that the text doesn't stretch or squash. This is because when the text is scaled, it takes the scale of the smallest axis and applies that to the other one. The way the speech bubbles work is there is a mesh object called mesh bubble that instances all the objects in the instance object collection. This means if you want to change these effects, you need to select the mesh bubble and go into the modifiers panel. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh my god, that's a lot of inputs. That's fine. You only need to be concerned with the top few inputs most of the time because of these buttons in the add-on panel. The speech bubble emotions buttons change the geometry node inputs to give you guessed it, different emotions. If you're not selecting the mesh bubble, then clicking on one of these buttons will give an error. These buttons do not create speech bubbles with those emotions. All they do is change the geometry node inputs of the selected object. The last emotion button I will explain later, and I will go more in depth into all of these geometry node inputs near the end of the video. I've set the mesh bubble to be in front when selecting, which means that you won't accidentally select the outline or the original mesh that's in the instance object collection. Sometimes you want multiple speech bubbles in a row that all follow on from each other, so you select the text and the large empty, which is secretly the meta ball in the instance object collection. and Shift D to duplicate them. To change the text, click on the text object and go into the modifiers panel. You can paste in your sentence, and you can also change the text box size here. Text type length changes how many characters are visible and is controlled by the input of the same name in the mesh bubble. This means that you can control the text in all of the bubbles from one place, but you might notice that they all reveal at the same time. That's where the character count before comes in. What happens is it takes the text type length and subtracts the character count before, and that is the number of characters visible in that bubble. If you put the character count of all the previous bubbles into the character count before, then it will lead from one bubble to the next. I have tried automating this, but I can't find a way of accessing the character counts of previous bubbles. I've tried coding, drivers controlled by coding, and geometry nodes, but none of it worked. If you can think of a solution, please tell me. If you want a completely new bubble that isn't connected by a line, doesn't share emotions, and doesn't have the text controlled by the same input, then you can just append another bubble using the same button. If you want to add a custom object to the speech bubble, simply move it into the instance objects collection. It's now being instanced by the mesh bubble, and you can have all the effects you want. But you might notice that it's a bit hard to select, can peek out sometimes, and doesn't track to the camera. To fix this, you can press the last button in the add-on panel, and it will give it a large empty, give it a transparent material, and make it track to the camera. Keep in mind that the empty given to the object is part of the object and not a separate one. If you want to change the order of the connecting line, you can rename the object, as the line goes in alphabetical order. I find it easier to simply put a number in front of the name. Back to the modifiers panel in the mesh bubble, the first input is segments. When you're using a metaball, this will be arranged from 0 to 1, where 0 is the maximum geometry density and 1 is the minimum. I know it's unintuitive, but that's just how metaballs are. If you're using a polygonal speech bubble, this will be a range of integers from 3 to 100, where it corresponds to the number of sides the polygon has. You will notice that the text type length has keyframes. This is just to save time when animating the text appearing. Keep in mind that there are two keyframes, one at the frame you appended the bubble, and the next is 2 frames later. It uses linear extrapolation to carry on typing out afterwards. Bubble color changes the color of the speech bubble and the extrusion of the text. Text and outline color does what it says on the tin, but keep in mind that this color is not affected by lighting. Text extrude emission strength changes how bright the extrusion is. I did this because, especially in cycles, shadows made by the text can make it hard to read. With the shade smooth input, if the object is shaded flat, then it will become smooth when it's turned on. If the object is shaded smooth, then it will stay like that even if this input is turned off. Off means that objects share whether they're smooth or not from the original object. On means that everything is smooth. Outline thickness does what it says on the tin. Mesh boolean is there for when you're using cycles in a polygonal bubble, because there can be some Z fighting when they intersect. In any other scenario, turn this off as it can make it quite laggy. Spiky on/off does what it says on the tin. It allows you to turn off the spikes but keep all the settings as they were. When using the polygonal bubbles, I found that the emotion preset buttons won't look that good, so most of the time you can just flip this switch and it gives you what you want. Probability allows you to change the probability that a face will become a spike. Keep in mind that if the speech bubble moves or rotates, then this creates a new index for each face, so the seed for the probability changes every frame and looks quite bad. Face size is useful for thought bubbles. Make sure to turn vertex crease off when doing this. Subdiff smooths out the spikes. With the metaball bubble, I made the maximum 2, and with the polygonal bubble the maximum is 4. Most of the time you don't need more than 2, but if you're using a square or a triangle, it needs the extra geometry to look smooth. If you have a lot of bubbles in your scene with spikes and subdiff, then it can get quite laggy, so turn subdiff down if you're experiencing this. Keep in mind that if they have a scale of 0, then it won't lag out your scene. It will only be the visible ones that slow it down. Vertex crease makes a subdivided mesh point again. This is why larger face sizes look weird when you turn it on. Merge by distance on/off affects the base mesh before the spikes are applied. Since metaballs have very bad topology, there can be some very small faces that then make thin spikes. This fixes that issue, but sometimes it causes some other issues, so you can turn it off. I've also removed this input for the polygonal bubbles as they don't experience this issue. Not all the spikes are the same height, and this is controlled by noise. Noise scale allows you to change how different the heights of the spikes are to their neighbouring spikes. Noise rotation allows you to animate the heights of the spikes. The presets do this by having a keyframe at 0 and 1 and having linear extrapolation. Keep this in mind when animating the speed, that there are already some keyframes there. From min changes how close the spikes are to the minimum and maximum heights. This means that 1 will make all the spikes the minimum height, and 0 will make all the spikes more random and closer to the maximum height. 2 min changes the minimum height, and 2 max changes the maximum height. This next section is about turning the arrow into spheres like you would see in a thought bubble. Number of thoughts changes how many spheres there are, and scale minimum changes how small the smallest sphere is. The cool spike effects is a place where I put random effects I found in my testing. Bubble spin simply rotates the bubble. This is useful for changing the direction of other effects. Add an unedited bubble is useful because if the spike goes inwards, then the unedited bubble will hide it. Flatten moves the spikes closer to the vertical or horizontal direction. It's also an example of where the spikes might go inwards, so adding the unedited bubble fixes it. This is also useful with the spikes on the square bubble. Connected line lets you turn on or off the line between the bubbles, and connected line thickness lets you change the thickness of this line. Keep in mind that the line goes in alphabetical order, so if you want to change the order, you have to change its name. There is an issue where, depending on the angle, the line has a different thickness, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it, and it's not that noticeable. Pulled back is useful for characters in motion. It's also an example of where the spikes might go inwards. Spike spin rotates the spikes. This might be useful if the character is spinning, or to add emphasis to the text. Snap does a similar thing to pulled back, but it's a bit different, and only tends to look good with a high density of spikes. And finally, remove front spikes allows you to stop the front faces from becoming spikes. I've had a lot of fun creating this new update, and I'd like to thank Stampede for helping me come up with new ideas and test the add-on. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check them out. I'd also like to give a smaller thank you to ChatGPT. I can't code without you, but that doesn't mean it's a fun time. I hope you really enjoy using this add-on that helps you speed up your speech bubble workflow. For those of you thinking that this add-on is quite simple and not very complex, I'd like to point out that I put a lot of effort into making sure that if you append multiple bubbles, it doesn't all fall apart and start referencing other bubbles that were appended first. If you have any suggestions on how it could be better, or issues that you find, feel free to let me know. Stampede also created and animated the characters in the intro, so I'd like to thank you again. One thing I did find out whilst making the intro is that the motion blur really struggles with the measurables, so I had to turn it off when the character started talking. I also started using Excel of all things to write my scripts, as it can automatically give me the character count and character count before. If you want to copy this, here are the formulas.